All right, we'll go ahead and get things rolling here. To introduce myself, my name is Katie McNeila, Corporate Marketing Manager here at Spinutech. For any first timers joining us today, let me tell you a little bit about Spinutech. We're a full service digital agency that specializes in building full funnel strategies that drive traffic and convert leads. We have offices in Cedar Falls, in Des Moines, Iowa, and Tampa, Florida, as well as remote team members in more than 30 states. In total, we're clocking in at about 170 team members these days. But today is not all about Spinutech. We also have a special presenter joining us from Basis Technologies. Basis is a cloud-based workflow automation and business intelligence software platform for marketing and advertising. And we've been proud to partner with Basis for programmatic display advertising for several years now. At both Spinutech and Basis, we're always looking ahead and planning for the future. And as you can imagine, that becomes a little bit more difficult in times of economic uncertainty, which is what we're here to address today. Our two presenters are going to discuss the different challenges that economic uncertainty creates for brands and consumers alike. But more importantly, they're going to help you create a roadmap for navigating those unique challenges. So let me introduce our two presenters. Today, you'll be hearing from Caitlin O'Brien, the Media Innovations and Technology Manager at Basis, and our very own Matt McKay, Senior Programmatic Media Strategist at Spinutech. One final note before we get started, feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation. You will notice the chat feature has been disabled for today's event, but we will be monitoring the Q&A feature and plan to leave time at the end to answer your questions. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Caitlin to get us started.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie and team. Just really excited to be here. And I'm going to kick things off. Today's presentation is titled Advertising Through Uncertainty. And I'm sure you're all here because this is an ongoing issue or ongoing conundrum that we've been facing for the past few years. It's kind of a few years that's been characterized by nothing but uncertainty that hasn't really resolved itself, but it's just kind of evolved. So today we're going to address what's driving this uncertainty, how consumers are responding, and how it's going to uniquely impact you as a brand or an advertiser, and then where those opportunities lie for you to proceed with confidence. So kicking things off, no surprises here, but we're just going to address the source of uncertainty, which is really this ongoing volatility that's making strategy development really difficult to kind of pinpoint and keep at a steady rate. And again, no secret here, but the past few years have definitely had their share of instability. We've gone through a global pandemic, ongoing job layoffs, geopolitical disruption, inflation and interest rate hikes, overall economic uncertainty or instability. And so this change has just kind of become our new normal. And I think none of us would have put these on the bingo card in 2019 if you'd asked us, like, what do you foresee for the next few years? And really, again, I think a good word that got overused early on in 2020 was unprecedented, and we just keep seeing these events kind of pop up. We saw some instability happening over in Russia over the weekend, and really all that really points us to is that nothing's off the table, and we've kind of had to learn to live in a state of preparedness, which again is why we're here today. And so we're going to really just get into how advertisers like yourselves can be prepared and just kind of move forward steadily and with confidence. And brands are kind of in this unique position because they're facing instability and evolving challenges from all sides. So you have your economic challenges on one side that's going to have business impacts and implications for you just as a brand. And then you have the consumer challenges where they're responding in their own unique ways to the economic challenges that they're facing. And brands are finding themselves caught in the middle of both of these phenomena that are happening and having to deal with navigating and managing both a business perspective, again, and a consumer perspective, which really plays out in our paid media. And that paid media impact was really pretty immediately felt about this time last year. We saw a lot of headlines that were speaking to economic uncertainty. Advertisers didn't know how to move forward. Forecasts were really difficult to predict just because we were in this much greater state of instability. And we saw about 20% of advertisers were going to cut spend by this time last year, essentially. And since then, we've seen things kind of level off. I think advertisers and brands have kind of figured out how to adjust to this new normal of just always needing to be on their toes and just looking ahead to the future. And so we're seeing a good chunk of advertisers don't plan to cut budgets in 2023. And actually, as of May, just this past month, we saw our first year-over-year increase in ad spend. So a lot of bright spots to look forward to, but still needing to understand how these events are going to impact our strategies. And Matt, I know you've experienced this on your end at Spinutech, but what does that kind of like look like from a day-to-day basis?
No, absolutely. You really hit the nail on the head. I mean, from the agency side, last year we definitely felt the crunch overall. A lot of our clients either reined back spend at some point. Some unfortunately cut budget altogether. But as a programmatic trader and a campaign manager, we're prioritizing the health, the overall campaign life cycle, pacing and delivery, inventory sources, KPI performances. We're analyzing all these things, but just flat out, will the client have marketing dollars for us? It's not something that's been on the front of my mind in years past, but definitely something that we were thinking about last year for sure. But with that all being said, 2023 definitely has been a little bit more steadier month to month. Budgets have been where we expect them to be, and throughout the year it's been definitely back to what we would prior to 2022 and year over year what we have seen overall.
Yeah, I love that point you make about brand health and just seeing that brands are continuing to spend and continuing to steward their business by investing in paid media. And so we do see that advertisers are continuing to spend, and a big chunk of that is going to the fact that we're seeing a lot of digital innovation in this space, which we'll speak to a little bit more on the next slide. And we saw, so Magna just released their updated ad spend forecast. They're the media investments branch of IPG, and they are projecting growth in the overall space, although they've dialed their numbers back a little bit. A big part of that dialing back was coming from traditional media. So they looked at challenges and underperformance that was happening in traditional media. And then on the flip side, we're seeing there's this great amount of innovation that's happening on the digital side that is actually driving these ad spend forecasts and leading to just greater opportunity for advertisers to be smart, be savvy about where they're making their investments. And so being able to continue to spend with confidence at or within channels or tactics that are a little bit more accessible. So it's either easier to pivot into them, they're more cost effective. We know that they're going to be more strategic. So things like retail media networks, ad supported streaming, all coming with the benefits of the power of digital, whether it's the addressability component, the measurement component. Again, just really being able to hone in and focus on our audience and reaching them in an impactful and relevant environment.
Yeah, the digital innovation that's gone on in the programmatic space has definitely made huge waves with our clients. I know they look to us to improve upon their ad spend specifically in digital when it comes to traditional TV, maybe moving away from that, like linear audio, radio as well, and trying to focus more on a targeted approach within digital because of the technology innovation and targeting options that are available out there.
Totally. And we see this play out in a few other realms too. And again, I know you mentioned that brand health, but just really looking at how this sets brands up for the long term and how advertising through uncertainty is really building for the future for brands. We have a few just ways that this is playing out on the next slide. So again, like overall, it's a long-term play. Like, of course, we're building our campaign strategies for the short term to keep our business objectives going and to continue to build in the performance arena. But what it really helps you do is to, again, build for the long term. So whether you're entering into new markets, Southwest Airlines is actually someone that did this sometime during the pandemic, like heat of the pandemic years. They saw their competitors pulling back from these markets as they were being a little bit more fiscally conservative, being mindful of their budgets. And Southwest saw that as an opportunity to say, like, we're actually going to enter into that new market and capture greater market share. So being able to capture greater market share, being able to maintain your market share by continuing to spend and have that presence among your audience, and then also just capturing from an audience perspective or a consumer perspective, gaining new consumers, maintaining your audience base, gaining their loyalty or solidifying that loyalty, especially as consumers are so open to brand switching right now as they kind of look out for their bottom line. So again, just kind of being able to maintain your brand and continue growth within your brand. And the next few slides will address some obviously tactics and strategies in order to do so. And they really boil down to two main principles where marketers can be overcoming new hurdles. We'll move on to the next slide. So we see this kind of boiling down to two facets. Of course, one is the consumer. They're the ones who are going to be interacting with our brand, buying our products. And so we kind of have to get at the underlying points of their psyche or what's going on in their lives. So we need to know how they're spending, why they're spending, how are these economic challenges impacting them in a unique manner. and how are they responding as a result, or where are they consuming media, or what messaging are they receptive to. Then on the other side, from a brand perspective and from just an overall paid media execution perspective, being able to adopt agile practices. And I think that, again, this is something that some advertisers have started moving into just as we live in this state of fluctuation and instability. But we're really going to look at some like best practices and ways that you can really stay on your toes and just kind of stay ahead of things and not just be reactive, but proactive.
Yeah, and clients can definitely have some reservations about the changing landscape overall, but with, as you mentioned, having an agile, being able to pivot away from some things that aren't working can definitely help clients alleviate their concerns overall. And as advertisers, we can really take advantage of this consumer behavior that's changing on their side with the right tools and the media mix that we'll get into a little bit later overall.
Definitely, yeah. And we see this playing out in the programmatic space, which is really where we'll lean in. Without further ado, we're going to look at understanding the consumer just by looking at what are their expected or typical responses in times of economic downturn. So on the next slide, we'll just evaluate kind of some, I would say, expected behaviors. Like none of this would be shocking. We're going to see consumers either stop spending on discretionary purchases, non-essential items, slow their spending, focus on deal hunting, brand switching, as we mentioned. They're going to be using credit cards and buy now, pay later to be able to fund those purchases essentially. And then, of course, start focusing on their essentials like their food, their gas, their daily cost of living. So the start is definitely something that we would expect and probably something that everyone has done. I think the stop and the slow realms are where we're really going to focus in, and you want to really understand how consumers are responding in both the stop and the slow categories, just because it's going to fluctuate depending on how they're feeling from a financial security status, how they're classifying your product or service, both of which we're going to get into the next couple slides.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of your note, is just really trying to hit the consumers as they're stopping and slowing their certain spending. It opens up the opportunity to reach them for alternative brand choices, products, et cetera, and just trying to take advantage of that overall.
Definitely. So we do see consumers kind of break down into three overall personas or mentalities, as broken out by actually Harvard Business Review after the last recession. So you're going to have your slam on the brake segment. These people are going to be the most vulnerable and the hardest hit. You're going to see them have more of an immediate, more visceral response to what's happening in their environment. And really, like, discretionary purchases or non-essential purchases will probably come off the table for them for the most part. Then you have your pain but patient segment. So these are people who, in the short term, they're feeling a little bit stretched. They're going to be making those daily lifestyle adjustments, but they do have long-term positive outlook. This is kind of where the majority of consumers sit for the most part. And then you're comfortably well off. So they're relatively untouched by times of economic uncertainty. Their spending habits don't change too much. If anything, you might see them pull back in some realms, but for the most part, they're going to kind of stay the course on their purchasing behaviors.
Yeah, most likely your clients' target audiences fall into probably all of these buckets, right? Depending on where they are in their consumer journey. So I think the key is to trying to understand the different messages and tactics to really cut through the noise and reach them with a message that makes sense. And depending upon your basis campaign setup, you can break out different audience buckets, groups, or tactics. Just try and get as granular and specific as you can with what makes sense with your overall campaign setup. But it's important to still be relevant to the left side of these audience buckets, but while trying to maybe focus primarily on the middle right when it comes to maybe conversion driving or purchase actions overall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love that point you make or just around kind of breaking out a campaign to speak to each of these consumer bases, because we will probably see people fluctuate or move in between these different personas just depending on how they are being impacted financially based on economic or market factors at any given time. I think you might see someone who's in the pain but patient segment. If they are potentially paying back student loans, you might see them actually move into more of like the slam on the brakes or just be a little bit more conservative with their purchases. So just a great suggestion all around over just speaking to each of these categories and not focusing in on one or the other. For the most part, brands are probably needing to focus on a couple of them or all of them.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And on the other side, of course, people are going to be thinking about things just from a persona perspective, but that persona is really going to impact how they are scrutinizing and categorizing their purchases. So are they looking at something as an essential? Is it a treat, a postponable, an expendable? And again, just from a brand perspective, understanding how your specific audience groups or potential new audience groups are viewing your product or service at any given time. Have they moved your product or service from an essential into a treat based on unforeseen financial constraint or new financial constraint? Have you moved into more of like a postponable? So you might be playing a long game with them. This really all just informs like how your messaging is going to play out, what your media mix is going to be, and overall just how you are responding to the ways that people might be receptive to your messaging.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on this slide. I know this is more B2C focus, but this can also translate to B2B as well, maybe focusing more on the essentials versus postponables. So as advertisers, just trying to be aware of how the audiences are analyzing and perceiving your brand and how they're looking at you guys as in terms of a purchase decision overall.
Definitely. Yeah. And there's some great resources out there for this, whether you're looking at like Bureau of Labor statistics. I think it's Gartner or Deloitte actually has a great consumer tracker just in terms of different industry verticals and how people that are participating in those verticals are spending, their mentalities. So all great resources out there that you can kind of lean into and use as information in terms of understanding how consumers are responding. We are seeing this phenomenon, and I don't know, maybe you all have experienced this a little bit yourself in terms of just consumers can't stop spending. Our just willingness and resilience to economic pressures or strains have led to consumer debt increasing by $1 trillion over the past year from 2021 to 2022. And we're really willing to take on a lot of that debt because we have the quote unquote, I put this in quote because it's the means to do so, but you can, we have credit cards, there's buy now, pay later, people are dipping into their savings. And it's really born out of this mentality of, again, still that pent up energy kind of coming out of the pandemic. People are wanting to travel. We see really high travel rates in Europe right now. My Instagram feed is full of people traveling in Europe. I'm a little jealous. Same. Dining out, even those experiences, I think we see pretty regularly. People just want to get out of the house. They want to live their lives and feel like they are really living again. And then of course,
as a dad with two 5-year-old boys, I'm definitely trying to get out of the house as much as I can. So yeah, I feel that for sure.
Yeah. So those purchases are worth like putting on a credit card or just maybe budgeting a little bit more towards. So of course, people are spending in their energy, their gas, their groceries, their essentials. But we're really finding ways to foot the bill for our lifestyle purchases along with our life necessities. And again, we mentioned this could potentially change if you see student loan repayments restarting. The debt ceiling agreement could have implications for how certain people groups or subcategories of people are going to be responding to the market. It might put them in a little bit more of a financially constrained position. So we see this trend happening right now. You kind of have to wonder when the bottom is going to drop out, especially as these interest rates continue to mount. That's actually one of the reasons why the Fed is continuing to raise interest rates, is that we are still showing resilience to spending. But a good thing to keep an eye on, like when will the bottom drop out, or will the bottom drop out? And then we also see on the next slide just kind of ways that consumers are navigating this. A big part of it is deal hunting and value seeking. So we see Google searches, Google Trend searches are looking for deals. They're looking for like free parking alongside activities. 66% are searching for better deals, better product quality. So people are navigating ways to balance out their budgets and showing, again, that willingness to spend as long as they can find a good deal, or for the most part, when they can find a good deal.
Yeah.
We see this on, like TikTok too, with the dupes trend. You see it on social media. You can kind of do like some social media listening, search trends again with Google, looking at forums. So just seeing how people are kind of balancing out their budgets or seeking out deals for themselves.
Yeah, sorry for interjecting there, but I was going to add an anecdote that I just recently, I had close family members that sold their house, and we were recently researching the most cost-efficient choices for internet and cable streaming providers for where they're moving to. And like personally, I recently moved into our house, and when I was looking at providers myself, I was looking mainly at what I had before and just trying to be convenient and stay with just trying to keep it simple and go from one to one. Versus now, we were looking at better deals. We're looking at like the price points and trying to figure out what the benefits, and like we're very more analyzing those things. So I know personally, I'm definitely doing that a lot more than I have in years past, just based on how the overall economic landscape is looking, and just trying to find what makes the most sense for as a consumer for our situation.
Definitely. Yeah. Like those life events can even trigger a propensity to brand switch or look for a better deal. And it's something that I think is always desirable for people to get the best deal, but especially now it's desirable. So for brands to really be leaning into that trend and to be adjusting messaging and supporting and facilitating that trend is huge in order to maintain success. And again, like either keep your consumer base loyal, gain new audiences, not to be or avoid being the competitor that's going to actually lose market share because they're not offering a competitive deal or the best deal or value that people are really looking for. So we talked a lot about consumer behavior. I think the big question that lingers now is, how does this all come together? How do I as a brand apply this, and what does that process look like? So we kick off with the need recognition. So first, just fundamentally understanding, where is your product or service falling for your specific audience group? So are they viewing it as an essential, a treat, a postponable? And then looking at, how are they conducting their information search? Like what channels are they going to? What channels should you be present within? What are they valuing? Are they looking for quality? Are they looking for discounts? What does their like paid search history tell you? Or what does their, with you have social listening in place, what does that tell you about how they're seeking out information around your product or service? And then deliberation. So how long are they sitting in that information gathering and need recognition process? And how long do you potentially have to message them? That kind of informs like, how long should our campaign run? Are we playing a long game? Is it a shorter game? Do we need to up our frequency because we don't have as much time to secure that conversion? So everything is upfront processes kind of guiding your immediate media strategy. And then ultimately seeing, did someone purchase? What did they do post-purchase in particular is important. So I think a lot of times we run media campaigns and don't necessarily follow up on the outcomes from a perspective of, why do people make those purchases? What was it that drove them to ultimately choose our brand over another brand? Did they leave a review? Did they talk to our customer service reps? Are they showing a propensity to purchase again? If you fall into a category, that could be a recurring purchase or something where they could increase their cart size or their order size. All things to think about from a post-purchase perspective, which again, I think gets lost sometimes in our media strategy process.
Yeah, this visual is very striking because as a consumer, like you can see all of the impacts that are just they're dealing with in each stage of the process. And so as advertisers, just trying to drive a relevant message that cuts through the noise and resonates with your consumer on each of these stages, even throughout post purchase, because whether it's a content download or some sort of customer success person to try and help continue drive that brand, there's definitely ways to continue messaging throughout the whole process and just trying to make it relevant to your target audience.
Definitely. And I think sometimes we are our own best case studies. So just thinking about, how do I purchase? What does that process look for me for various products or services that I am interested in or that I am needing? So we also can have our own intrinsic bias, but I think, again, just thinking about, how do I make purchases and what does that mean for maybe how I could apply that into my media strategy?
Mm-hmm.
So we're moving into the home stretch. We're going to look at how advertisers and brands can overcome uncertainty, both from understanding the consumer and applying those learnings into your media strategy in particular, and then looking at just some general paid media best practices. What should brands be leaning into right now? What are things that are just going to steady the course and keep you navigating this uncertainty in a strong way? And the first, we're really just going to start off with the fundamental principle, which is to go back to the basics. And really this failure to go back to the basics in each planning cycle is resulting in a failure to iterate and innovate. And I know that this sounds basic, for lack of a better term, or maybe for a better aligned term, but I think a lot of us sometimes have a hard time being critical of our existing strategy. We see a quote on the next slide that kind of speaks to this specifically. We'll jump to the next slide, Kate. Thanks. Again, it's something like back to basics is a fundamental principle of our marketing strategies, but it often falls by the wayside as we, in a digital environment in particular, we're moving quickly. Like we're putting together plans quickly, we're approving them quickly, we're launching them quickly. So it's just the nature of digital to move quickly and kind of bypass that step of going back and saying, do we have the firmest foundations in place? Is there something that we should revise? Are we missing opportunities because we're just kind of cranking out our media plans? And then on the flip side, it's also a response right now in particular to uncertainty. I think we have a tendency to be more prudent, to be more reserved in our media planning, and kind of stick to the status quo. And I think a good pulse check for brands is to just look at this quote and ask themselves, like, is this resonating with me? Do I feel like this is something that we might be falling into a pattern? So the fresh thinking that led to a company's initial success is often replaced by a rigid devotion to the status quo. And Matt, I know we've talked about this, kind of commiserated over this experience from a media planning and buying perspective, but how have you seen this play out at Spinutech? And what have some of the like potential negative impacts been?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I feel this quote so much. I mean, like at Spinutech, we really pride ourselves on our outside the box thinking, our pitches, and trying really gaining our clients. And I know we've been a part of some amazing collaborative, cool ideas with, social team, pay, the account team, just collaborating on ideas and coming up with some awesome ideas. I've definitely stolen some stuff from social and pull it over to programmatic and seeing how that can be really great for our clients overall. And clients, sometimes they can get focused on, they get tunnel vision right on the successes out the gate and like trying to go with sometimes going back to the beginning and getting them excited about new ideas, interesting ideas it can be tough because they get that tunnel vision. They want to run the hits. They don't necessarily want to innovate and try new things because the unknown is scary, right? And they know that like audience X drove this amount of leads last year. Let's continue and hammer those guys and continue doing what works and not necessarily trying to try new things and reach audiences in new ways that is more cost efficient and can cut through the noise better overall. And at Spinutech, we're definitely focusing on trying to get our clients onto new and interesting ideas as the industry is always changing and offering out new opportunities overall.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that balance of kind of like sticking with what we know is going to work while also looking at innovations. We'll cover that in a few slides, so I won't reveal too much now, but I love that you kind of gave like the little precursor there. And so, yeah, we see that people are just really looking at, we'll go back. We'll hit these few pitfalls of bad media strategy or things that kind of stunt growth and really are born out of this miss that we have of going back to the basics and evaluating our fundamentals or our foundations. So the first is just a failure to face the problem. And what I really mean by that is just a failure to foresee anything that could potentially impede or impact the success of your paid media strategy. A great example of this is Coinbase. So with their QR code Super Bowl ad, everyone jumped at their screen, like grabbed their phones, is going to scan the QR code. And ultimately their website crashed. And they just did not foresee, for whatever reason, that the millions of people watching the Super Bowl and scanning that ad would create too much of a load on their website and ultimately would crash, leading them to miss even more leads that they could have gathered. And on the other side, or as a follow-up, they didn't see the education need. Like cryptocurrency is a nascent space. People don't understand it. They don't know how to navigate it, what they should do with it. And so there wasn't really a follow-up educational component to keep and nurture those leads that they gained from that ad. So on all that investment was just kind of a flop. And Coinbase is not doing well these days. I don't know if you still follow the cryptocurrency space, but sorry, they are a little bit down and out right now. 2 and 3 go together. They're both centered on goals and just how we set our objectives. 2 is mistaking goals for strategy. So really looking at a campaign and saying, I, for example, want to drive app installs, so I'm going to run an app install campaign. That's a facet of your strategy. It's not your entire strategy. So just thinking about what are the greater components of this strategy that are going to support that campaign, but also, again, help us build a little bit more for the long term. And then 3, we see scattered strategic objectives. And there's a couple things here, but primarily it's that we aren't necessarily always intentional with how we set our KPIs. And what I mean by that is that we are assigning KPIs per channel, but not thinking about how all those channels and those different KPIs are going to work together and how they're going to interact with each other and kind of create this domino effect to support and lift each other and ultimately drive our end goal, which is probably something like a lead-based or a revenue-based KPI. And then 4, just cycles of recycling. So I think something that we all face in the media planning world or media execution world is pulling assets from, like, let's say traditional TV into a social channel. It's easy, but it's not necessarily the best fit for that channel. There's a specific consumer or user experience, user expectation that people have in social versus a traditional or even a CTV, digital TV environment. And then we see this play out with campaigns as well. I'm going to come clean here. Like, I have definitely either just extended a campaign end date or more or less copy and pasted a campaign from quarter to quarter. And again, didn't go back to the basics, early media planning days. But again, you just move so quickly that those approvals, like, you have to come in hard and fast and like, okay, well, we'll just duplicate the campaign right now and like, we'll adjust it down the road versus going back to the beginning and really setting your foundations in place. We spent a lot of time on those slides. We're going to look a little bit at creative messaging on the next slide. And again, more strategy oriented goals in the next few. So tying this back to how we can speak specifically to the consumer and how this is going to play out in our media channels, what are some specific messages that we can, or messaging styles that we can use to speak to consumers and say, I understand what you're going through. Just give them a little bit of a nudge that says, I'm listening, I know what you're going through. I can commiserate and I can help. So the first is just to address friction. We probably all ran into this early on in the pandemic. There was some product that we couldn't find just due to supply chain disruptions. So Colgate made an ad in direct response to that. I think what they could have done a little bit better is even just added some kind of incentive like we see with the next creative. So they're helping consumers offset those costs. Again, as we know, consumers are deal seeking and they want that value exchange. And it could be the tipping point between a different brand or your brand, or them choosing your brand over another brand. And I know Matt has experience in testing promotional offers to just determine what works best for his respective clients, because it definitely varies based on the product or service offering.
Yeah, I'm gonna just try and keep generalized, but yeah, we recommend many of our clients to have a multi-message approach in order to really set ourselves up for success. You know, an A/B test of creatives definitely has an impact on audiences and like how we can optimize against that stuff. As we talked about earlier, depending on the client life cycle, there could be so many factors and different messages can hit users differently. So just having those options to be able to optimize against can really set the groundwork for a successful overall campaign. I know we have a lot of consumer brands where we've tested percentages off versus dollars off, and just kind of depending on what the brand is or who the target audience is, what works best, and trying to optimize against those. And then if it's a B2B brand, maybe it's a focus of like a prospecting message for the beginning, and then like a more targeted conversion driving lead focused message later down the road for retargeting. So kind of having those options to play with a little bit can be better for the whole brand and the campaign and just overall.
Yeah, creative testing is so integral, especially as we, again, are faced with a little bit more uncertainty and our status quo has kind of been upended. The last creative style, of course, is to build loyalty. The reason we mention it is just because, again, that brand switching and really needing to retain your consumer base and grow your consumer base. So how can you encourage people to do a repeat purchase, increase their order size or their cart size, really just solidify that customer loyalty to your brand, which again is more of a long-term play. Like, this is a nurturing element. This is a long-term brand building component. Whereas the first two styles kind of like bring people in.
Yeah. I was just adding in like post-purchase, or like, and like if it's like, it could be like a content strategy or something like that to continue to stay relevant for these guys.
Yeah, definitely. And just looking at, like, as an aside, creative quality, we're seeing really moves the needle for brands. It always has, but I think that's something that we're seeing coming to the forefront of best practices for sure, as we're faced with this uncertainty. We're faced with just the cookieless future. We're seeing that creative is kind of being bubbled up as this response to navigate all that and to really secure brand performance in the face of everything that we are navigating at this time. So quality definitely matters. Programmatic is an exciting space right now because there are so many different ad formats you can take advantage of that go well beyond the banner. We actually have a whole separate presentation on that. I won't get into it, but just thinking about what your creative looks like when it's going to be received by the consumer. And so we alluded to this a little bit earlier, but how can brands kind of balance out the need to stick with what they know, stick with what's working, but also take advantage of some of these innovations or new opportunities that are coming up? And the easiest way to remember this is just to skip the shiny, but take calculated risks. So shiny being something that is a little bit more ostentatious or something that might not make sense for your brand and is a heavy investment and you don't know like what the performance outcomes are going to be. Calculated risks being something like, how can I extend what I'm doing already? We see AI as a big conversation topic right now. Google and Meta make this easy to kind of dabble so you can build off of your existing Facebook or Instagram campaigns by using Meta's Advantage Plus shopping campaign. So they have a ton of tools in that suite that you can leverage. Google's Performance Max, again, kind of an extension of your paid search campaigns that allows you to use those AI-based tools. And that's just one example, but again, AI is a hot topic right now. I think that's definitely very relevant, and it doesn't have to feel out of reach to try out these new tactics.
In terms of some calculated risks in real time, like I know, for example, like if you're running a display campaign, you're seeing maybe CNN.com or something, or the business tech side of CNN is strongly resonating. Maybe you could move into a CTV PMP and focus on CNN inventory and stuff like that. Or if it's maybe Yahoo Sports is performing really well, maybe it makes sense to look at CTV PMPs for some live sporting events or ESPN content or something like that. Just trying to hit your target audience when they're outside of those outside the display aspects. Just trying to focus on where your audience is, and like you can make some assumptions based on where your target demo is going. I know in terms of like retargeting side of it, I know in terms of driving white paper downloads, we can assume that we have an audience of users that are constantly downloading content pieces from our brand. And maybe they want to reach into the podcast space. We can maybe give them a podcast message and then see if that resonates in the audio space and how they can become a lead that way as well. So just making assumptions and trying to take some smart, calculated choices on where we can update our targeting and take new chances.
Definitely. Yeah, I like the point about moving with consumers and just meeting them in a space that might be more novel, so to speak. So like podcast space is novel. Something that they haven't necessarily interacted with from a brand perspective can really be that disruptive element. I think like digital out of home is also a great example on that end where it's still novel. They're not expecting it necessarily, and they haven't more or less learned how to tune it out, or might just be more receptive to those new spaces.
Yeah, definitely for digital at home. Like if there's a conference or something that's coming up, maybe your audience is going to be there. It may make sense to take a calculated risk and do some digital out of home billboards around that conference to build your brand up there as well. So there's opportunities out there with the changing landscape for sure.
Like it. We have a couple more principles for you. The next is just to plan to automate. So we spoke a lot to needing to maximize your time, maximize your budgets in times of uncertainty, and automation is definitely a big way to do this. So we as media planners, like you want to be using your time as efficiently as possible and as effectively as possible. And we as media planners on average basis did a study with one of our partners and found that we're using 9 different media planning platforms throughout our day, which is just a lot of dropped time moving between platforms. And ultimately we're spending about 6 hours on menial or low value tasks. So things that could be like updating ad tags, doing naming conventions, managing conversations between different vendors. If you put all of that process into a media automation platform, it's going to just do it with more or less a click of a few buttons, or even just using those platforms for historical data so you can benchmark your campaigns before you launch them again, kind of leaning into that back to basics principle. Like, what can we expect from a performance perspective? What have our competitors in the same industry vertical been doing? Where is the flexibility and fluidity that we can take advantage of, whether different tactics or different channels? I know at Basis, we are pretty obsessed, so to speak, with just evaluating and improving our partnerships, the features within the platform. So we have weekly platform updates with new just like UX improvements, integrations. We're actually launching our programmatic digital out of home integration with Vistar pretty soon here, really building up our programmatic guaranteed deals catalog. And then we're also launching an ability to buy broadcast radio through the platform. So really just bringing everything under one roof allows you to not only have that fluidity and that agility that you need, but also just have all of your reporting in one spot and really just not be moving between those platforms.
Yeah, automation has definitely made our jobs a lot easier. I'm old enough to remember manually inputting macros into ad tags prior, way back in the day. I know personally, like I've used the automation platform within Basis to help do some inventory forecasting and tool and planning overall for new business pitches. So not only do I have what's really available from primary targeting, budget capabilities, and also restrictions as well. And those are also saved in there. So now I can just literally go in there once we have the new business, can populate that campaign and get that off the ground way faster than starting from scratch. So the automation stuff on the Basis side has really come twofold since I've been involved with the DSP the last 2 years for sure.
Yeah, I think it's the little things, but it also then leads to the big things. So automation has, I know, been a huge lifesaver for our teams as well. And then our last principle or our last best practice is just this is more of an overall business perspective or play, a long-term play, but just monitor the market. So what this really means is understanding what's going on in the greater world, in the industry, but going beyond those headlines to understand what is the domino effect that they could have on your brand. A little bit of an obscure example, but something where I'm kind of a weather nerd. So I was reading up on just this transition that we're having from La Nina to El Nino, and actually found that it historically has impacts on like agricultural and manufacturing regions. And from an economic perspective, has historically impacted GDP growth or has created inflationary pressure. So again, kind of a unique example, but it is something that we're facing right now. And from a supply chain perspective, that could impact some brands that either you work with or your brand itself. So understanding these phenomena that are happening, kind of looking forward to the future and saying, what might happen based on what I'm seeing going on in the world or in the industry right now, and how can I create a strategy for my brand or a contingency plan to navigate that when it comes and be more proactive versus reactive.
Yeah, on the agency side, we try and constantly think about the external factors, monitoring the market and competitor analysis and competitor trends, tentpole advertising opportunities, the Super Bowl, March Madness, these all of these things are out there. But at Spinutech, we are always thinking about contingency planning and opportunities overall. We have a team down in the Florida regions. We're constantly talking about some of the pain points of that area of the country with hurricanes. I know you're talking about the El Nino and El Nina stuff. 2022 was hit pretty hard last year. And so one of our paid strategists was constantly talking about having not necessarily an emergency fund, but like a plan in place to have opportunities to shift focus away from what maybe performance isn't performing so hot based on what's going on. So what can we do to shift budgets or spend our dollars more efficiently in areas that make the most sense? And having brought this up a couple of times and just having some sort of plan in place. The client loved it, so now we have that plan ready to go. Knock on wood, should something happen. But it's also there in case of pause opportunities too, right? I mean, some of our clients have testing budgets, as we more often call it, or not. Maybe it's for a conference targeting or the Super Bowl, March Madness stuff that we talk about. And those constantly popping up throughout the year. So just having some sort of plans in place for stuff we don't necessarily foresee when we're planning, our yearly plan overall.
Yeah, I love that example you bring up because it really points to like this is not just a task that can occur at an executive level, but really as media buyers and planners, we can look at things like, is the Super Bowl happening around this time? Is it an election year? What does that mean for maybe our costs within certain channels?
Big time. Yep.
Yeah, like heavier investments in CTV. So can we expect to pay more there? Do we need to maybe adjust our budgets or our budget allocations to offset some of those costs? So yeah, just not something that's just at an executive level that's kind of out of reach for day-to-day media buyers and planners, but definitely something that you can participate in and help your clients navigate.
Mm-hmm.
We'll close things out just with a quick plug for an overall health check, just evaluating your brand fitness. So your own assets, your customer relationships, your employee education, all these are going to have impacts on your media performance. So things like, what is your website experience when someone gets there? Are your organic social channels impactful? Are they informative for people who are looking at them? What are your customer relations like? What are they saying about your brand? How are you responding to show them that you're listening? And then employee education, again, as we see a lot of this innovation happening in the digital space in particular, how are you as maybe a media director or manager kind of facilitating those growth opportunities for your greater team and kind of leaning into those and seeking out those opportunities. Again, all things that can have a direct impact on our media performance, but we often kind of forget about. We'll close things out with just a few recap pointers. I know we're coming up on time. We've covered a lot of content, so we'll just boil it down to three main things. And the first is to overcome uncertainty by remaining agile. We spoke a lot about agility, but it really is about putting yourself in a position to pivot. So whether you are using a media automation platform, considering onboarding to a media automation platform, but on the other side, just again, I think Matt alluded to this a bit in some of his examples, but just that willingness to be able to move with agility and to pivot into new opportunities or test out new things. And then alongside that, just getting buy-in from the team members to support strategy shifts. It sounds like with that client in Florida, it was so imperative for them to get that buy-in so that they can turn that strategy on right when they need to, instead of having to wait for what could be a lengthy approval process. The second is to develop a roadmap to navigate fluctuating markets. So again, kind of leaning into that monitor the market mentality or tactic and just saying, what can we foresee, or what have we maybe seen as trends for our brand, or how could events that are happening right now play out and impact our media strategy. With the TikTok ban that was bubbling up a while ago, like if TikTok was an imperative part of your media strategy, what would your pivot plan be? What would your kind of contingency plan be? So it's essentially just planning for the future and foreseeing things and being able to have a proactive response, again, instead of that reactive response. And then finally, control what you can and build for the future. There are so many things that are out of our control, especially from a brand perspective, but I think it's just a good reminder to not panic, just keep a level head and know that there are so many things you can do from a paid media perspective that will ultimately help you kind of overcome whatever events or fluctuations happen in the market. We have so many tools at our disposal now as digital marketers that ultimately help you build your brand for the long term, nurture the audiences that you are engaging with, and just ultimately put those investments to good use. With that, I think we'll open it up for any questions. Last 9 minutes.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. That was an excellent summary of today's conversation. Yes, and we did get several questions that rolled through during the presentation, so I'll go ahead and jump right in. Our first question for the team: when deciding which tactics to invest your media spend in, how do you distinguish between a calculated risk and a gamble?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it kind of goes back to one of our earlier slides that spoke to those digital innovations and looking at the decision-making process for those. So is it something that is still strategic for me? Does it align with my audience and my brand objectives? What is the required investment? A lot of times these newer kind of smaller calculated risks have a much more reasonable quote unquote price tag associated with them. An example is like the metaverse is definitely not a calculated risk for most brands. I would say the majority of the brands, except for those like Coca-Cola, who had some disposable budget to work with, they could afford to make a big splash and have it kind of maybe go nowhere. But for brands that are more on like this kind of like practical, regular day-to-day basis, what is it, something like an AR filter that you could take advantage of? So really just looking at what makes sense for my brand, what do I have the funds for? And on that note, I think it's good, Matt mentions this several times, but having kind of those rainy day funds for these test opportunities or for opportunities where you need to pivot. So calculated risk is something that is still strategic. It's in line with your brand and your objectives, whereas a gamble is kind of just, we're going to roll the dice and see what happens.
Yeah, you nailed it. I think it's just what the keywords that calculated that you're making us. You take a look at data. I look at the data side of it and like, hey, this can definitely parlay over there. That's kind of how I look at calculator versus the gambling. It's kind of more what Caitlin was talking about earlier, for sure. The meta side of it.
Great. Our second question, what would you recommend as a practical first step when developing a contingency plan?
Yeah, I think kind of just going back to the beginning, or again, going back to basics and saying, what do we know about what's happening in the market right now? Doing that evaluative process, kind of taking all the factors into account, reviewing your data, your own campaign data, aligning on objectives with your stakeholders or with your media team, and then getting buy-in from those stakeholders so that, again, that you can move as soon as it's necessary.
Excellent. And then we have time for one last question. So last question, are there specific types of content that perform well in times of uncertainty? For example, promotional offers versus blog content, etc.
Great question. I think promotional offers is definitely one. Matt, I don't know if you've seen anything from like day-to-day campaign work on your end. Yeah, depend on the client.
Yeah, it can definitely vary depending on client to client, obviously, but like blog content is typically a lower, it's a little bit cheaper to produce, right? You don't have to, but versus a promotional offer, there is some sort of, there might be a buy one, get one free or discount off. You're obviously eating some cost there versus a blog content. You might already have that content. So just about promoting that or like re-promoting that. Maybe it's an old piece you want to bring back. Yeah, definitely blog pieces can keep your brand front of mind for maybe we're talking about the slow down and stop consumer side of it, but just keeping them in the funnel for maybe down the road as a postponable purchase or something like that. But yeah, I guess it really depends on your brand. I know promotional offers are very successful for B2C. And in times of uncertainty, when users are talking about the better deals, like that's definitely speaks to that for sure.
Yeah, I think there's a need to just have like a greater focus on relevance too. So maybe not running kind of the same old messaging that you have been, but thinking about how can I kind of tweak this messaging a little bit to create greater relevance for my audience, or even just create greater moments of education so that they understand what I'm asking them to do or what the value proposition is.
Absolutely. All right, well, that concludes our time for questions today. If we didn't get to your question or you think of something later, I invite you to shoot us a note. The email address is on the screen here. And before we close up shop, I want to say thank you to our presenters today, and thank you to everyone who took time to their busy schedule to join us. Our next webinar is coming up at the end of July. And in that webinar, we'll be outlining the internal and external influences that are threatening your e-commerce business and potentially sabotaging your ROI. So you want to stay tuned for that one. Because you attended today's webinar, we'll go ahead and email you directly with an invitation to the next one. Thank you again for joining us today. We'll see you next time.